So last week I talked about a Warframe that's not really the best at anything with Rhino, and hell, let's continue the trend and talk about another Warframe that's not the best at anything with Inaros. I think that Inaros is a lot of fun. He definitely plays differently from a lot of other Warframes, although he does kind of need some extra investment if you want to get the most out of his abilities to deal damage by also investing in a good melee weapon. So I'm not even going to bother talking about all the stuff that goes on with his swarm cavats. They don't really work properly at the moment, and even when they do, they don't really feel the best on Inaros. It's just kind of a slow, not particularly strong armor strip. So we don't even have that ability on Inaros. We're just going to ignore the swarm cats, and we're going to talk about everything else. So Inaros has his funny little passive where he can become like a sand version of himself when he goes down, and you can attack enemies to get yourself back up. So Inaros already is more or less unkillable to begin with, but since he's a health tank, there is always the chance that you're going to get hit with something really big that could put you down. So this is pretty much just going to ensure that you are never ever going to die with Inaros, which is pretty nice. Nothing to scoff at. Desiccation isn't really used all that much when we're focusing on Sandstorm because we don't really need to worry about getting finishers on enemies in this particular manner, and the lifesteal also doesn't matter because Sandstorm itself is able to steal health from enemies' hits. Sandstorm, if it hadn't been set up properly, if it hadn't been coded properly, would be just an incredibly annoying ability to use. But as it stands, it actually does a very, very good job of pulling enemies in around you, keeping them near you when you move around, pulling enemies in towards you when it deactivates, and pulling items into the sandstorm as well. So this is actually very useful. The stats on its own aren't very impressive, but again, this is where we need a good melee weapon in the mix to really push this thing up much, much further and make Sandstorm actually a very powerful ability on its own. Scarab Shell is one of the big things that helps Inaros stay alive. You just sacrifice armor or you sacrifice health to gain armor. And while Scarab Shell is active, you have status immunity, which also includes staggers and knockdowns. And it will consume 5% of your total Scarab Shell in order to protect you from status effects. So it's not just a permanent thing that stays up forever. When you're getting hit with statuses, it will drain a little bit, so you'll need to activate this once in a while. The nice thing about this ability when Inaros was updated was that you now can at least move around while this is active. Not very fast, but hey, you can at least move around so you don't have to just be running to a corner room away from enemies to activate this and then draining your health and hoping you don't die in the process. And since we're focusing on an ability which really, really likes status effects, we're going to use Roar. If you don't know, Roar has this funny interaction with status effects and abilities where it essentially applies the damage increase twice on status effects in the same sort of way that faction damage mods do. So that's why we're going to be using that here, along with the fact that, as I said, Scarab Swarm with the Sand Cats is just kind of a buggy mess right now and not really worth using, and even if it did work properly, it's probably still not worth using. So we'll look at the Inaros build first, then we'll look at the melee weapon. The reason we need a good melee weapon is because of the Elemental Sandstorm Augment. This will change the damage type of your Sandstorm based on damage types and mods. That's very important because it means that whatever damage types your melee weapon has built into it are going to be applied in the sandstorm. So if you wanted to use, say, a hammer, you're not going to be getting slash status effects in the sandstorm. You're going to be getting impact status. For the most part, obviously, if we're going to be focusing on status damage over time, slash is kind of the way to go. So you want to pick a melee weapon based on that. And then other mods are going to also affect this. So applying additional effects like viral means you need to mod for it on your melee weapons. You kind of need to have a specific build set up for that in order to take full advantage of Elemental Sandstorm. Also, let's just ignore that Archon Vitality. I forgot to change that. I was testing something else out, and it wasn't nearly as effective. So as you can see here, this build actually has enough space to use 2 Umbra mods without using an Umbra Forma. I know not everybody likes doing that, and especially if you're not sure if you want to use a Gnarl. So now you can do this first, and then from there maybe throw on some additional Forma if you want to. I know I don't have anything on the Exilis, and honestly that's because he doesn't really need anything on the Exilis, but also at the same time, if I wanted to use one, I needed to put an additional Forma on there, and we're already at 5, so if you want to use an Exilis mod on here, probably either Cunning Drift or Power Drift just to get those small incremental stat increases. Obviously, PSF is not needed because of your Scarab Shell, so it's pretty much just whatever small incremental increases you want to throw in an Exilis slot if you want to go all out on Inaros. I probably should at some point, but I'm being lazy today. Since we're running negative efficiency, I'm going to just take the easy route of using Arcane Energize over here and Molt Augmented for Power Strength. Power Strength is kind of the thing that you want to dump all in on this because it's going to increase the base damage of your Sandstorm. It's also going to give you a big increase to your status chance as well. And of course, more Power Strength means more damage increase from Roar, which is fantastic. So that's why we're dumping all the Power Strength on here with Blind Rage, Umbra Intensify, which is also buffed up by Vitality, Transient Fortitude. We want a good amount of range on here. Overextended is the easiest way to do that while also using some of the additional mods on here for survivability, which would be where the Vitality and Adaptation comes in. I know that's going to sound a bit redundant because if you know anything about Sandstorm, you know that this does make you invulnerable. But here's the thing. We're not focusing on using Sandstorm 100% of the time. The reason being is that since it mostly focuses on status damage, you're going to have a hard time killing Eximus enemies only using Sandstorm. We're going to be using the melee weapon not just as a stat stick, but also for killing enemies as well. And since there's going to be some downtime between when you're using Sandstorm, it feels very nice to have some survivability mods thrown in here. If you're not worried about that, you could always, instead of using Overextended, go with just Stretch and Augur Reach to have a little bit less range. You could throw Cunning Drift up in the Exilis slots, sacrifice some of your survivability for more range without having to drop additional power strength. It's certainly an option. It just depends on how you feel about it, honestly. The additional survivability is nice just because then it makes it very easy to use a Naros for just about anything that you want. Maybe not Corpus enemies so much, but honestly, they're not even that hard to deal with Naros. It's not that big of a deal. And then, of course, Steel Charge up on the Aura slot just because he's already polarized for this, and we're using a melee weapon primarily, so why not? Pretty simple, straightforward build. If you use a Umbra polarity for Intensify, that gives you a lot more room to mess around with more mods on here, try different things out, really focus on the stats as opposed to adding in survivability mods. It just kind of depends on how you feel and how you want to use it. Now, as far as the melee weapon goes, I would say from what I've tried out so far that the Nami Solo does feel like the most powerful contender, but there's a few different options you can go with. So like we were talking about, you want to use something that has a lot of built-in slash damage on its base stats because that's going to affect your weapon in the end. So, no, actually not the Grand Prime. I know everyone, when it comes to great swords, wants to use the Gram, but honestly, in this case, Galatine is probably going to be the way to go if you wanted to use something different with just the massive amount of slash status it has, very little impact or puncture. The Nakanda Prime is a very good option as well. Same sort of thing, lots of slash with low impact and puncture, so you're very heavily weighted into slash status effects with your Sandstorm. And the other one that I do actually use to a certain extent is the Slatra. These are probably the two that I would recommend, the Slatra and the Nami Incarnon. Both because they are machete weapons, and the machete stance for heavy attacks is very, very nice for this particular setup. The Slatra is just capable of doing a lot of slash damage as well with very high base damage. And the reason I would use the Slatra for any particular situation is because the much higher base damage that it has does a very good job of just killing enemies quickly without having to build up anything first to get the damage up high. So, kind of spoiling the Nami Solo build here a little bit. This is basically what I do with the Nami Solo. It's probably better in the case of the Slatra to just kind of focus on upfront damage. It's probably using Galvanized Reflex instead, just something that can build up much faster than as opposed to using melee crescendo. It's very easy to get finisher attacks on enemies with Sandstorm. So if you're going to go for a more long-term mission, more than like say, blitzing through a 2-minute exterminate, then you probably want to build around crescendo instead. But if you're not going to do that, you're better off probably just, in this case, dropping Blood Rush for Galvanized Reflex and then throwing in... Honestly, I don't know if there even is a good arcane option in this case. You don't get knocked down on machete heavy attacks, unfortunately, so melee afflictions isn't really the way to go. Probably you can just stick with crescendo, but I don't think that's really the best option there. You could go with fortification just to be funny if you wanted to, but let's be honest, that's really not all that great. Exposure, I mean, it's not like this isn't really the way that I focus on playing Inaros, but this is probably what you would want to do if you're going to go with just a more fast-paced setup for going through missions quickly. Pick out an arcane that you think fits in. You could definitely, if you wanted to, try and make this a melee influence build, but melee influence isn't going to activate through Sandstorm, so just keep that in mind. Slaytra is definitely a good thing to use, but we're going to stick with the Nami Solo Incarnate for this to show this off. This is the same build that I was using before. Since we're going to use melee crescendo to get finishers, that's why we're not using Galvanized Reflex. I'm using Galvanized Steel more so for the crit damage than anything else. Blood Rush actually works very well in this case for getting us huge crit chance, because there's going to be enough time in between when we're actually using the weapon and with Sandstorm active for the built-up combo that we have with melee crescendo to go back up to its high amount, where it will actually benefit us having Blood Rush on there to get a very high crit chance. We'll be having 4 separate status effects inflicted on enemies with this weapon, so Conditioned Overload is fantastic to have on here. Primed Reach to make sure we hit everybody. Maybe not necessary, but if you get enough enemies grouped up around you with Sandstorm, they are definitely going to get pushed further and further away from you. Amalgam Organ Shatter, because we're going to be using some heavy attacks in here. Since we want to mod for status effects, we are actually going to, for once, use some elemental mods on a melee weapon. Virulent Scourge and Vicious Frost to get us viral damage. We don't need higher status chance because enemies take damage so rapidly in the Sandstorm that it just doesn't matter. Killing Blow, kind of a flex slot if you wanted to use something else. You probably need to put an additional form on to use anything that's more expensive. But since, again, we're going to be using some heavy attacks fairly often, Killing Blow probably the best option to put here. If you wanted to make it easier to build up melee crescendo, you could always put in Finishing Touch here to increase your finisher damage. And then as far as the evolutions, the only one that really matters is the 4th one, getting Absolute Valor for crit chance. We really don't need status chance specifically on Inaros. This is all just focusing on using this weapon for Inaros. Not so much if you're just using it more on a normal basis. I don't really know. I haven't honestly done that. I'm pretty much only focusing on Inaros with this weapon. And then the other 2 are just kind of whatever feels good. Heavy attack wind-up speed is perfect, and the other 2 for this case really are just not useful for us at all. We don't need combo duration, and we don't need follow-through. Well, follow-through is not terrible, but the wind-up speed is really nice to be able to just kill enemies quickly. And then the first one, well, we're playing Inaros. We really don't need health on finishers, and it's not that much health anyways. So, pretty straightforward. It does definitely take more investment than some other Warframes, since you kind of need a weapon to pair with Inaros, but it's a lot of fun. You'll see it actually works really well even against armored enemies, no problem. Over here, I have some Energy Max shards because we didn't use any space for Primed Flow. Again, if you wanted to drop something like Umbra Vitality or Adaptation on the build, you could definitely fit in Primed Flow and then ditch these. Otherwise, if you're going to fill in the rest of these slots, I would just go more Power Strength. If you wanted to drop your Arcane Energize, you could probably fill these in with purple Equilibrium shards instead. That's definitely a solid option. You're going to be getting plenty of drops from killing a good amount of enemies. So if you wanted to use a different Arcane, use like, say, Arcane Fury on Inaros, then you could drop Arcane Energize and use purple shards. Otherwise, if you want to just stick with Energize and make it nice and simple, you can use some red shards on here for more Power Strength. I'm going to change quickly over to a Death Cube setup. It's not a great Death Cube setup, but I don't need Shade for this because we're going to be using some melee attacks. So let's go beat up some Grineer and make them cry about it. It's pretty hard for most enemies to deal with this setup because even when you do drop out of Sandstorm, you have so much health and you're going to have a lot of damage resistance from Scarab Shell that enemies are really not going to be able to do much about you just kind of beating them up. Just quickly activate Scarab Shell at the start of a mission, drain your health to get that armor boost. That will go up more and more as you build up Molt Augmented, so we're going to start off just activating Sandstorm without Roar. Gotta get some energy first. Now, since we're using Melee Crescendo, we need to get some finisher attacks on enemies to start building that up. Using finishers is not super exciting when you're using Sandstorm, but if you want to get really high damage, it's definitely the way to go. And the thing is, the damage that you get from the finishers, even without focusing on finisher attacks on a Nami solo, is actually very good. So, might not be super exciting to be doing this right at the start, but it does definitely kill things. And if you don't have a lot of enemies in the area that you're at, just pick them up and start bringing them towards the other enemies that you can see on your radar. We're at a nice 10x combo now. I think it's going to go down a little bit. Okay, we're at 9. And the nice thing about using Melee Crescendo for any setup like this is that you don't have to worry about having a maxed out one. This just means the higher you get the rank of your Melee Crescendo, the faster you're going to be able to build this up. So I'm not even going to bother with finishing the rest of these dudes. I'm just going to do the heavy attack, and there you go. They all die. It's a little bit easier to show off visually why we want to use a weapon with a machete stance. When you see the heavy attack, just spinning around you and killing everything that gets dropped at your feet is perfect for this. You scoop up enemies all over the place. Once they are primed up with Viral and Slash, you just do that, and you can hit them for millions of damage with this setup, which is really funny. We're not in a great spot to be picking up lots of enemies, but you get the point. And the thing is, even when they do show up, we have so much health that the little bits of time where we are vulnerable, these guys aren't going to be able to do much to us. Of course, once again, you can see how the combo counter has plenty of time to build up in between heavy attacks, so having that very high level of Melee Crescendo is actually very useful. We can take full advantage of getting up to a complete permanent 12x combo to do lots of damage to big groups of enemies. Maybe not big groups of enemies. You can definitely kill groups faster than this, but this is a super safe way to kill lots of enemies for sure. The only thing that you want to keep an eye on a little bit is your Scarab Shell. As it starts dropping down a little bit, you get time to use that up again. And of course, when you do reactivate it to charge it, that does actually bring up the power strength with whatever your Molt Augmented is currently at. So it's very easy to refresh. You don't have to wait for it to disappear entirely. You can just refresh it whenever you need to by recharging it, and it will take into account whatever your Molt Augmented is currently at. So the combination of having well over 1,000 armor and adaptation makes Inaros' health portion of his kit actually strong enough to be somewhat useful, which is nice. It's not completely necessary if you want to go full investment. If you want to just like really go max power on this setup and not worry about survivability since you have invulnerability on Sandstorm, those would be the things I would recommend dropping. Adaptation and Umbral Vitality. Not necessary at all for making this build really strong and for killing enemies. So, up for personal preference. There's really no, most builds are not, oh, there goes the Acolyte. Most builds really aren't so limited that you can't find some room to put in the things that you want to fit in, so don't be afraid if you think that this doesn't look the way you want it to build it, to modify it. Do what you want with it. There are a shit ton of mods in Warframe for a reason. There is all sorts of room to build things the way you want to, so And hell, if you don't even have a good Nami solo incarnate to use, don't let that dissuade you from doing this either. You're still going to get lots of damage from a dedicated heavy attack build if you get up to a 12x combo with melee crescendo, because that's just how good melee crescendo is for heavies. And since we actually have enough time in between attacks to build that up, having the ideal weapon for this setup is good, but you can use pretty much anything with heavy slash weight, and it's going to kill things. Like, you can do this with the Nakana Prime, which is what I was using originally, and I mean, it's going to take things out without a problem.
When you need it, extraction is ready.
Yeah, I'm going the wrong way. What a surprise. I swear, I seem to get this tile more often when I'm trying to record something than when I'm just playing the game normally. I see that damn tile on the Kuba Fortress way too much. It really annoys me. I can't help it. I want to see some more funny numbers. See, some of those guys are even dying up in the Sandstorm when we have Roar powered up with Molt Augmented and we're getting the extra damage for Sandstorm. The actual damage that Sandstorm deals is pretty significant. I know most of the kills were coming from the sword, but that's just because it spins around you, so it's very easy to kill the entire group that way. And once the enemies are primed with status effects from the Sandstorm, you get a big damage boost from Condition Overload. So that actually reminds me, there is one weapon I would not recommend that seems like it would be good, and that's the Door Clove. I know that one doesn't really get used much anyways because it's a sword and whip. That is the only melee weapon I know of that is slash damage only on its physical damage, which is good in the sense that it means you will get nothing but slash status effects in the tornado. But if you are trying to focus on getting heavy attacks and finisher attacks, you will only have slash damage in it afterwards for Condition Overload, which isn't ideal. You're not getting a lot of impact or puncture status effects from your Sandstorm with this, but it's enough that you are going to get the additional damage for Condition Overload, which is definitely worth it. So there you go. There's the funny, spinny Sandstorm guy who I made spin even more with a machete weapon. It's pretty damn hard to kill Inaros. This will work for just about anything unless you are dealing with all Overguard, but that's annoying for basically every Warframe, so, nothing new there. And you can take this dude into any Warframe mission you want. Obviously, probably not going to be level cap viable. He's going to just get one shot once he drops out of his Sandstorm without any shield gating. But you know what? That's fine. Let's be honest, most of us are not going to level cap on any sort of regular basis anyway. So for everything else, being able to just run through missions as a blendy Sandstorm boy like this is fun and strong. Go take him into a Netrocell, pull enemies into your security area, and kill them all quickly. It's fun. It's great. It's a good time. I'm glad Inaros is actually good now because I've liked him for a long time, and now he can actually do good things and be useful in more than just staying alive. He can actually kill stuff too. Fantastic. Who would have thought?